Good morning. My Bible is going to be opened up to the book of 1 Peter, 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to be reading from there and studying from there here in just a moment. I would encourage you to open it up there as well. After you do that, I want you to imagine with me. Picture it in your mind. It'll be important. But imagine if I were, when I came up here to preach this morning, I was dressed head to toe. I mean, completely decked out and dressed like a clown. And I came up here this morning and I was preaching and I was teaching and I was moving around and I had the big red wig on and I had the noisy nose and I had the giant shoes and the colorful clothes. And I waddled around up here the entire time that I was preaching dressed exactly as a clown. Now, I want you to imagine that, and I want you to understand how all of us would, number one, really struggle to hear or to listen to anything that I said, right? Because you're looking at me and you're like, man, this joker is dressed like a clown. Why is he dressed like a clown? That would be your question, right? Why is he dressed like a clown? Why did he do that? Why is he dressed like a clown? He looks ridiculous. You would snicker every time I walked and my shoes would squeak with every step. You would think every time, that is absurd, that is ridiculous. You would laugh. You would be thinking, why is he doing that? But yet also you wouldn't be able to take your eyes off of me. You would be watching and you would be looking and you would be pointing and you would be thinking, why is this guy dressed like a clown? Nobody else is dressed like a clown. Why is he dressed like a clown? Now, all of us understand that. I certainly would never do that, but I want you to think of the extreme of that analogy and where we're going to take that for us today. There is a difficulty for the Christian. A difficulty for the Christian living in the wicked world that we live in, operating in the darkness that we operate in. Well, whether it be each and every day that you go to work, surrounded by wickedness, whether it be each and every day you go to school and the wickedness that resides there, maybe your family is lost and darkened. Maybe the hobbies that you have, the places that you go, the world that we live in is wicked. But yet at the same time, as a Christian, we are walking around each and every day dressed like a clown. And at work, as a clown, people look and people snicker and people point and people notice. At school, dressed like a clown, people point and they look and they snicker and they notice. And the reality of that is that kind of living can be challenging. We understand that. God understands that. Living in a way to stand out. Living in a way that's different than everyone else around us. Speaking differently and doing different things and going different places and looking and dressing different. All of those things cause us to stand out from everyone else. Everyone else at work we are different from. Everyone else at school we are different from. And people take notice and people will oftentimes snicker or laugh or question why. Why would you do something like that would cause you to stand out so drastically from everyone else? Isn't that uncomfortable? Isn't that awkward? Isn't that weird? Isn't that strange? And the reality is, it is. 1 Peter chapter 4. Look at what Peter says at the beginning of verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, Peter says, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. Do you see the point that he's made? He says, listen, Christ suffered in the flesh, in this world, because he was so drastically different. And God is telling us we have to arm ourselves with the same mind. We have to be willing to do that as well. We have to be willing to take on that level of suffering. He says there in verse 2 that we're no longer living in this world according to our own lusts and flesh, but we're going to live according to the will of God. And he gives some examples of that in verse 3 of these are the things that you used to be about, and consequently, these are the things that the world is about, but now you are different from them, and so you're not about those things. But look at the point that he makes in verse 4. Of 1 Peter chapter 4. He says, in regard to these things that the world participates in, that you don't, in regard to these, they think it's strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. You see, Peter is making the point, and God is making the point, that is the reality for the Christian. That as we step away from the world, as we separate ourselves from them, and the way that the world acts and speaks and moves and looks like and watches and listens to, as we separate ourselves from that, the world will look at us dressed as a clown and say, you know what, that is strange. I would never do something like that. Why does he do that? Why does he take on things like that? That's ridiculous. That's absurdity. Speaking evil of you. Now, let's not cover over the fact that there are times that is hard. It's hard to live that way. It's possible because God has called us to live that way. Now, this morning, we're not going to get too fancy. It shouldn't surprise you because I started with the image of me dressed like a clown. But we're not going to get too fancy this morning. We're going to set some foundation, some principles, some realities we're going to set in place. And then we're going to close with two ways that God has helped us make that kind of living easier. Because it's what he's called us to do. And because he's called us to be that way, we know it's possible to live that way. We think about this reality and this kind of speaking. It is the idea of holy living or holiness. Look over the book of 1 John with me. In the book of 1 John, what's interesting is when we talk about holiness, I want us to always recognize that we need to do so with the idea of what God's holiness is all about. Because he calls us to be holy as he is holy. You see that in both Testaments, both the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus in chapter 19, and in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 1. In both places, he calls on us to be holy as he is holy. And so for us to understand what our holiness is to be, we've got to understand what God's holiness is. We've got to understand what that is all about. And again, he doesn't get fancy about that. In 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5, it tells us that this is the message that we've heard from him and declared to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness. That describes God's holiness. He is completely and utterly separated from darkness. There is no darkness in him at all. He is completely separated from that. He is separated from darkness. He is separated from sin. He is separated from evil. He is separated from wickedness. There is no darkness. There is no evil anywhere in his character. And so for us, we are called then to separate ourselves in the same way. As he separates himself from wickedness, we are called to separate from wickedness. How do we know that? We'll continue with the context. We've read verse 5 of 1 John chapter 1, but look at verse 6. If we say that we have fellowship with him, that's God. If I say I have fellowship with God and walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And the blood of Jesus Christ, his son, cleanses us from all sin. And so how do we know that what he says about God in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5, that in him is light and there is no darkness, that is something for us to emulate because of verses 6 and 7. He says, if you're claiming to have a great relationship with God, but yet are residing in the darkness, you are a liar because God is separated from that. It is the fact that you walk in the light where God is that you have a relationship with him, because as God has, you have separated yourself from the darkness. And while everyone else is walking in the darkness, they see you walking in the light. And they question you. And they ask you and they ridicule you because you're there walking in the light. In the Gospel of John, specifically in John 17, we're going to reference that, what Joe read for us there, but we're going to actually go back to John chapter 15 and pick up a little broader piece of the context. But in John chapter 17, Jesus is considering all of these things specifically with his disciples. And he has a conversation about them, mainly because he is about to leave. He's spent some time with them, but he's about to leave, and they're going to be on their own. And he is dealing with incredible opposition, and he knows that when he leaves, they're going to have to deal with incredible opposition. And he's trying to equip them to handle that. And so we read there from John chapter 17, verses 12 through 19 at the beginning of our lesson, and he's making the point that, yes, you are in the world, but he continues to reiterate over and over and over this phrase, but you are not of the world. It is that phrase that he continues to reiterate. He started the whole conversation. I mean, this entire conversation with that idea. You could go back a couple of pages in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 15 now. In John chapter 15, look at what it says in verse 18. As he's having this conversation, in this text, a long, drawn-out conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples, he says here in John chapter 15 and verse 18, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. He's helping them to understand that reality is coming. And so he says this, if you were of the world will love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And then that phrase he'll reiterate a couple of times as he prays in John chapter 17. But I want us to think just for a second about that idea. Certainly holiness is found there. There's no question about that. In a lot of ways, it's a very definition of holiness, of being set apart from the world. But yet there is a reality that we occupy this world. But yet we're reminded by God that we're not of this world. So the question is, well, what does that mean? And so to help us understand that, I'll put a question on the screen behind me. And it really, for me, comes down to this question of, well, what is your source of information? What are you drawing from? Because it's one thing to be located in a certain location or environment, but another thing entirely to draw from them as a source of information or behavior. And so the question is not necessarily where I am located currently, it's where I am drawing, or what am I drawing from in where I am located. So questions like what we see or what we hear, what we fill our minds with, what are those kinds of things like? What am I being influenced by? Maybe is a better question. What am I being pulled by? Am I being pulled by God? Or am I being pulled by the phrase, everyone, ... You see, the temptation that we have in the world that we live in, at places like work or places like school, places like those when we are surrounded at times with people from the world, is to be propelled by the everyone ... Everyone is speaking this way. And so I'm going to speak that way because I look different if I don't. Everyone watches these things. And so I'm going to watch these things because it feels very awkward if I don't. Everyone listens to this. And so I'm going to do that. Everyone dresses this way. Everyone dresses this way. Everyone wears these kinds of clothes. And so I'm going to wear those kinds of clothes because it's awkward and different if I don't. Everyone goes to these kinds of places. Everyone does these kinds of things. Everyone speaks these kinds of words. It is that everyone ... that we are driven by. And so if we live and we lean into the everyone ... what is then our source of information? Well, what are we influenced by? What are we pulled or pulling from? The world, or are we pulling from God? And sometimes we're like, well, it's just so hard. It's impossible not to be influenced by the world. It's impossible not to pull from the world. It's impossible to look that different. And every time I have that thought pop into my own mind, or anytime I hear someone say something like that, I am continually reminded of the story in Genesis chapter 6 of Noah. In Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 5, it says that the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his spirit. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. And so he's painting this very bleak picture of the world, an incredibly bleak picture of man. And the wickedness of man was so great, God says, I'm going to destroy man and basically start over. Every single thought in his mind is on evil. This is the world at that time. Verse 8, however, there's a ginormous word at the beginning of that verse. That in the face of this situation, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. But Noah was dressed like a clown and stood out by himself and leaned into God in the face of that circumstance. Did Noah fall prey to everyone ... He didn't. And so because we see something like that, it helps me to say, I can do that. I can do that. One other piece of foundation before we get to the two things that can help us is understanding the reality that the world itself is nothing but a trap. That's it. It is a trap. Have you ever thought about you set a trap up maybe for an animal, or maybe you've had mice or rats or something, and you set a trap up, and it looks ridiculous, and sometimes you're like, I mean, why would they ever walk into that thing and get snapped in half or get stuck to that thing? Or why would they ever do that? Or you see, like in the cartoons or like in the olden days, the bear traps with the big giant metal claws, and it's got a big chain wrapped around a tree, and you're like, why would he ever step on that? Like, wow, does something like that ever work? I mean, you look at it and you're like, well, nobody would ever, not even a bear would step on something like that. But yet, guess what? Traps work. And that's where we are with the world. The world is a trap. And we could stand up here and say, well, I mean, there's so many ridiculous things in the world. I would never fall prey to something like that. But the world is a trap. There's just no getting around it. The reality of what the text tells us, Scripture tells us about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, our decision-making, and where we go and what we lean into. What feels right to me, what looks right to me. The pride that we get wrapped up in. You see, we often get ourselves into trouble within the world because we are simply looking to impress man instead of God. When God asks us to be a certain way, but we choose the world, we're looking to impress Him. And so the reality that we live in, and the difficulty that's there. And so let's close with two very quick things. Because listen, we're all sitting here, and all of us can picture, and all of us can imagine. And I'm not standing up here this morning trying to instill upon you that it is easy to stand out and be a Christian at work. Or that it is easy, or not a challenge, or this is something that takes effort and forethought to be a Christian and stand out at school. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it is those things. And I think God understands it is those things. And I say that because He has given us things to help. So there are two things. And I'm going to ask this morning that we lean into both of these things. The first is this: dedicating your whole self to God. That goes off of the point we had just made about the pride of life. That we live in a world in which I'm conflicted on impressing man, impressing the everyone, ... or am I impressing God? If I dedicate myself to God, I dedicate my whole self to God, it makes living separate easier. Because I'm not concerned with everyone, ... I am concerned with God. And so you have an admonition like this in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. How do we do that? How do we dedicate our whole self to God? Well, Paul tells us that we give God our bodies. He'll talk about in Philippians chapter 1 that he thinks about his relationship with Christ, and he says with his body he magnifies Christ. What a powerful thought that is in Philippians chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. We've got to dedicate ourselves fully to God. We give God our mind. The world that we live in wants to control our mind. Does that sound great? That doesn't sound great. The world wants to control our mind. God wants to transform our mind. And we give God our will. Your mind controls your body. Your will controls your mind. We start each and every day by yielding to God our bodies, our minds, and our wills. We dedicate at the beginning of every day, we dedicate ourselves to Him. being separate throughout that day becomes easier. Because I'm not interested in impressing everyone, ... I'm interested in impressing God. And now being different, now being separate, looking and acting and sounding different from everyone else becomes easier. But still a challenge. There's one other way I want to help as we close. The way that God helps us to understand the difficulty of this and how easy of a time it can be. And what God has given us that we have to lean into. Paint this picture. All week long, dressed like a clown, I have been at work, and people have looked, and people have talked, and I feel alone there. And that's hard. All week long, I've been at school. And I have been there dressed like a clown, and everybody has looked, and everybody has pointed, and it has been tough. I'm dealing with that, with those challenges. And I come here on a Sunday. And I come into the auditorium, and I sit down, and I'm thinking about the challenges of that, and I'm thinking about how tricky that has been and how tough that has been. And in through the door walks in my good friend Tim Arden. And Tim Arden comes to the front and he sits down right next to me. And Tim Arden comes to the front, he sits down right next to me. And Tim makes his way down to the front and he sits down right next to me, and he puts his arm around me. And I start to think, you know what? As I'm sitting here dressed like a clown, Tim has walked in, and guess what? Tim's dressed like a clown. His wife is with him, and she's dressed like a clown. John and Amy, they come in, and guess what? They're dressed like clowns. And everyone here starts coming in on Sunday, and everybody here is dressed like a clown. You know who set that up that way? God did. And so now as I'm sitting here, and I'm dressed like a clown, but yet Tim is sitting here and he's dressed like a clown, and I'm looking out, and everyone is dressed like a clown. Guess what? Being dressed like a clown isn't that big of a deal anymore. And what if I spent not just this hour with people like that? What if I surrounded myself with people like that? You see, that's where God has pushed us to lean into. Why? Because it's tough being dressed like a clown. But it's easier when there's other clowns sitting next to you. You can go sit down next to those clowns over there. How foolish it would be if you aren't taking advantage of surrounding yourself at times like this. This is a way that God encouraged. Are we here to worship Him? Absolutely. Are we here to remember Him and the sacrifice that's been made? Absolutely we are. Are we here to praise Him in song? Yes. Are we here to study from His Word? Yes. Are we here to pray together? Yes. All of those things are true. Yes to all of that. But He has asked us to do that together. So I can be reminded of what? I'm not the only one dressed like a clown. I'm not the only one. There are so many others. And that, my friends, makes it easier tomorrow to go to work or to go to school or to operate in this dark world. So you dedicate yourself to God, your whole self to God. You lean into the people that God has provided. And living in this world with an understanding that we are not of this world becomes easier and becomes possible. What a powerful thing God has done for us. He's asked us to focus on Him and our relationship with Him fully. Tim is going to lead us in a song of invitation. It's going to give us that opportunity to think about that relationship. It is the relationship that makes everything different. But ultimately, it is the only relationship that matters. This world, for God's people, is a nothing. This world, for God's people, is not our reality. Heaven is the reality. And that's what I'm focused on. This world is a nothing. This world is a temporary vapor that will vanish away. I'm focused on the world that will never vanish away. That's what makes it possible to operate here. Maybe we can help you in some way this morning. Maybe we can help you in your relationship with God. Maybe begin your relationship with God. Strengthen your relationship with God. Renew your relationship with God. If we can, you let us know as we stand and sing.